Patty just said it. Nothing else to say. Can you hear me?
Is it on?
It's on. So a vow is an aspiration, and as she said, in this vow, it's an aspiration for enlightenment. So the Ilwansang vow in Korean was written by Master Sotaesan, and it has exactly 365 words, which I find kind of interesting. I've never counted the words in our English version, but I suspect it isn't exactly the same. And it kind of summarizes much, if not most, of the teaching in the Red Book, all in this one page. And so we chant it to both refamiliarize ourselves with the main points of our aspiration for enlightenment, as well as the method. So I'm going to go through it. For those of you who are familiar with it, you probably know all this, and for those of you who aren't, you know what we're chanting about when we chant the Ilwansang vow. So the first line, and you can read it along with me if you want to. I'm not going to read it, but I'm going to read it. Ilwan is the realm of samadhi beyond words and speech. This line is exceedingly important because so samadhi is deep meditation or stillness. The beyond words and speech is really the part that I think is so important, because we're trying to talk about something that can't be put into words, and yet is what we're essentially talking about, what we're working towards, what we're trying to make sense out of. It's what we just read about in the Truth of Ilwansang. And again, if that was confusing, it's because it's beyond words and speech. But it's not beyond direct experience, and that's the whole point, is that this practice is about the direct experience of the truth of Ilwansang, both the ultimate truth and the relative truth, and how they turn and turn in the ultimate, reflecting each other, as in the Ilwansang truth. So Ilwan is just a symbol. Ilwan is an attempt to describe everything, all in one symbol. So, and it's the source. It's the source of everything. It's the ground of being. It's the ground of the universe. It's where everything comes from and everything goes back to. It is the cycle of everything. So the gateway of birth and death. And birth and death is really important in Buddhism because the whole idea in getting enlightened is to transcend birth and death. Transcending birth and death and being and non-being. That is something that comes up over and over again in the teachings, both the original teachings and Master Sotaesan's teachings, that when you're enlightened, you transcend birth and death and being and non-being. Since I'm not, I can't really explain it, but it seems like a great idea. Then it goes on to talk about the fourfold truth, the fourfold graces. Sorry. So we talk about in Won Buddhism, there are two paths that we follow. We follow the path of faith and the path of practice. The path of faith is not faith like blind faith, but it's the faith in gratitude to what we call the fourfold graces. And the fourfold graces, as we heard already today, is everything. So the fourfold graces is the notion of gratitude to all the things that we receive from the universe, and we could not live without, but often take for granted. But to me, even though I'm not so great at gratitude and happiness seem very connected. When we feel grateful, we feel happy. And so the fourfold graces often said to be the Dharmakaya Buddha Fourfold Graces, kind of a reflection of how the mind of the Buddha is reflected in everything in the universe, and that we could, if we allowed ourselves, be grateful for everything in the universe, and that would lead to happiness. So they are heaven and earth, parents, fellow beings, and laws. So Ilwan is the essence of things. It's the Fourfold Graces. It's the essence of the mind of the Buddha, the true nature of Buddhas, enlightened masters, and regular people, and all sentient beings. Everyone has Buddha nature. Everything, every sentient, every living thing has Buddha nature. You might say Buddha nature is what life is in a certain sense, but that doesn't quite capture it either. You might say Buddha nature is formless awareness, you know, when it says in the Truth of Ilwan song that the numinous awareness creates everything. You know, everything comes from numinous awareness. So it's kind of like all these things are overlapping and equivalent, and of course, it's hard to realize until you realize it directly, something I aspire to. So then it reviews the Truth of Ilwan song. Ilwan manifests as permanence and impermanence. Impermanence is ultimate truth. It's unchanging, it's ever abiding, it's voidness, it's emptiness, but it's not nothingness. It's the potential for everything. But it's also the fact that everything is interdependent on everything else. And so when we can see that directly, we realize that there's no birth and no death. No being and non, beyond being and non-being. So permanence it unfolds in an infinite world that is ever abiding, spontaneous, just as it is. And then, but also, you know, there's relative truth, and relative truth is not lesser truth, it's just different truth. It's what we encounter every day, it's what we need to keep examining in order to get to the ultimate truth. So if we, you know, it's not something we're trying to get away from, it's something we're trying to delve into and see more clearly all the time. And so, you know, what we see in relative truth is infinite unfolding worlds, you know, that are continually going through formation, duration, decay, and extinction, as well as for all beings, you know, birth, aging, illness, and death. You know, and we see this continual cycle, and what is permanent in that is the cycle itself, the constant changing of things, you know, and if we don't recognize that, then we're constantly suffering because we're fighting against what is the truth that we're constantly confronted with. And then it goes on to say that about karma, you know, that what happens to us is affected by how we use our minds and bodies. The four forms of birth. So one of the things that is really relevant to Buddhism is that Buddhism doesn't attempt to be an objective science. It's an objective science of subjectivity. So the things that are described in Buddhism are from not like third person looking out, seeing what, but rather subjective experience of oneself. And so there's these four forms of birth. I haven't got such a clear subjective experience of this, but you know, the four forms of birth are birth from a womb, birth from an egg, birth from water, and metamorphosis. And so if you didn't know all there is to science, you might experience the origination of things in those forms, like from moisture, insects coming out of moisture and things like that, or bacteria, things like that. It isn't a scientific explanation, but more a kind of subjective explanation of what we just observe when we observe birth. And then the 6 realms of existence, depending on where you study Buddhism, they can be thought of as realms where you're reborn into, or probably also, and I think in Won Buddhism it's particularly thought of as realms of that we're constantly being reborn. Every moment, every tenth of a second, we're reborn, and we can exist in these different emotional realms. Everywhere from the top realm, the God realm, which we kind of live in here in the United States, the heavenly realm, to what's called the Asuras, the Titan realm, where competition and fighting and the will to succeed, to the human realm, where there's the greatest chance for understanding and moving forward, but also great suffering, to the animal realm, where you don't really have a lot of choices, where you're kind of controlled by your impulses, to the hungry ghost realm, which is described as beings that have a very small mouth and an extremely small throat and very large stomachs, and can never get enough food to be satisfied, or never get so it's kind of the greedy, hungry, never satisfied feeling. And then the hell realms, which are described as kind of extreme aggression and anger. And these realms are things that we experience, or I do every day in various times, as little as possible, some of them, but still, it's like from moment to moment, you can go from bliss and, no thoughts and samadhi to, competition and frustration to, trying to figure out how everything works and make sense out of everything, to driven by desire and fear, to, these hungry ghost drums where nothing's ever enough. And, our whole society is kind of, patterned on the hungry ghost realm. And then the hell realm, which we get witnessed in, if not by ourselves, in politics every single day, and at this point in time, in terms of like people expressing all this hate and anger and rage and so forth. And it's kind of a subjective description of what these experiences are like from the inside. And, or you could say they're a description of suffering. I spend a lot of time on that. And again, how we act and what we do determines which of those realms we're going to be in. And we have some choice, even though it's not totally voluntary, as to whether we grasp and hold on and become attached, or are able to develop loving kindness and compassion and letting go in such a way that we enter these more heavenly realms and, hopefully in the long run get enlightened. So, next is, we talked about the faith idea in Won Buddhism, the Fourfold Grace, these ideas about how things work, and then we have the practice side of it. And the practice is the threefold practice, and it's described here. So we model ourselves after Il Song, the vastness, the emptiness, the roundness, the lack of edges, and we practice using the threefold practice, which is cultivating our minds, inquiry into facts and principles, and then mindful choice and action. And these are like a circle, again, in that the more we cultivate our mind, the more we understand things, the more we the more we study and look into things, the more we understand things. And by those two things, it gives us the wisdom to make choices that add to the world, add to our own positive experience, and bring something to the world too. So these kind of keep cycling back on each other, you know, that the more you cultivate your mind, the more you're able to cultivate wisdom. The more you cultivate wisdom, the more you're able to act ethically. The more you act ethically, the easier it is to cultivate your mind. And in the end, we're looking to progress towards enlightenment rather than regress towards the hell realms, and coming to the end. And there's a concept in Won Buddhism of harm from grace or grace from harm, which doesn't mean you have to be harmed to have grace, but rather that it's possible, even in the worst of circumstances, to gain grace, to gain value from those experiences. And it's also possible to have everything be going great and have that result in harm if we let it, you know, by becoming greedy and selfish and you know, and hurting others. So, you know, this whole idea is to continue moving towards grace and away from harm. And enlightenment, in the end, is becoming one with the nature of ill one, which is the full, deep embodiment of oneness, of completeness, of wholeness, and of openness and interconnection. So that's the Il Wan Song vow. It really, you know, if you combine that with the daily essential dharmas of daily practice, you pretty much got the whole Red Book. And so, you know, so it's kind of an aspiration that we chant every day. It doesn't matter really whether you chant it or not. It's just the idea of what are we trying to do when we practice Won Buddhism or Buddhism in general, and it kind of sums it up for us. So, thank you.